Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's April 22nd already. My gosh, 2021. I'm Professor Hamamoto, and I'm so proud and privileged to be with you here today. Please let me acknowledge in reverse order Mr. Norman Smith, the great guitarist, Piper Vogel, Dawn Horsense 222, Corky Goss, the Mobsterful, Karen Holland, and I see you're already here. You're ahead of me here. Ed Buck, buddies with Ted Lieu and Adam Schiff. Yes, indeed. And we will indeed touch upon that. And I'm here with my little friend today. He's Mr. Friendly Ferret. And together we're going to be ferreting out the truth, right? And this is just a reminder to all of us that 5 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, 8 o'clock Eastern, that I'll be joining the great team of John O'Loughlin and George Webb for the Thursday Trio. And we're going to be ferreting out all the intrigue that we're being hit with. Let's get right into it. There's a lot of material here. And someone mentioned, the comments are really good that I've been getting. But someone mentioned, hey, what about, Adam Schiff? Isn't this what you're alluding to when you were talking about Dr. George Hodel and that great book by the author Steve Hodel, his son? And I said, yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why it caught my attention. And there is a historical connection there. And there's I think a cultural connection as well between what's going on in 2021 and back in 1947, 48, 49, and into the immediate post-war periods. And again, I'll mention, and I'll touch upon this as well. I think George Hodel was probably doing what he did best in Asia, whether he was in Japan or the Philippines or the other parts of the Asia world, which is my particular research specialty, right? Asia, Asian America, Asia Pacific. And I think an entire volume could be devoted to unsolved cases in Japan that have a very similar modus operandus as what we saw in the Los Angeles area, the greater Los Angeles area. And as it turns out, probably other parts of the country as well, maybe even New York State. Florida perhaps had the misfortune of having Dr. George Hodel as a visitor or a guest there. He was pretty mobile and he could afford it. He was a wealthy professional and he had the perfect cover, right? Anyway, today's title is called Ed Buck and Hi Jingo. Most of you know who Ed Buck is, so that takes care of that. I'll amplify that a little bit later, though. But what does Hi Jingo mean? This is one of the key terms or concepts, really, that our friend, the author, Mr. Steve Hodel, introduced me to. And I said, oh, yeah, okay. I've always needed a sort of a shorthand for one of the chief frustrations of myself, and I'm sure for you, and that is this frustration that the upper echelon individuals, whether they're high income or they're connected in some fashion, and this is why, I'm interested in gangsters at all the levels, right? Why these upper echelon people, those who are a little bit higher in the social hierarchy or the pyramid, well, how did they get away with this? Why do they get away with it? It's so unjust, right? It's a biblical proportions, right? You know the story about Job. Why, God? Why me? Right? There are more deserving people who need to have a misfortune visited upon them than you and me, but we seem to bear the brunt of it, right? So this is not a new problem, and I guess that's part of our burden as human beings living in society. However, we do not have to surrender to it. We are talking right now. We're doing the research. We're doing follow-up. We're filling in here. And that in itself, at least in my mind, helps to ameliorate, let's put it, this lack of resolution, or I call it, the Greeks called it catharsis. It's sort of like, oh, I can exhale. Oh, I feel so good. And that's why we need music, Norman Smith. This is why we need film. This is why we need fiction. This is why we need soap opera. Well, soap operas don't really have an end, but it gives us a sense of resolution in a life where we are condemned to be without resolution. Except maybe, when we die, maybe there's not even a resolution there. We don't know. We'll find out at some point. Um, anyway, uh, he comes up, or it's not his invention, but he explains that in the police department, and I guess in the justice system in general, right? There's the phrase "high jingo" means certain people, certain individuals are untouchable. Certain cases, you can't go near them. Some of you, or most of you, probably are well acquainted with sensational and not so sensational cases. And the not so sensational means it's routine, right? We remember the O.J. Simpson case, right? He was exonerated from that, and God, there was such an incredible furor over that. And later on, O.J. Simpson was jailed and imprisoned on a much lesser charge. I think he's still in prison so far as I can recall. I haven't really been following that. And of course, the case of Dr. George Hodel has never resulted in an indictment, although it turns out he was a primary suspect all along. So anyway, hi Jingo, and that we're experiencing it now, right? We had a U.S. presidential election stolen from the American people, and we know who the people responsible for this hijacking, this takeover. We know their identities, and they're caught on film, and some of them have even bragged about their involvement here. And there they are; they're running free. So that's high jingo in practice. I won't belabor the point, but it's entered into my critical vocabulary as of reading that great book, The Black Dahlia Avenger, and I encourage you to read it. And I also encourage you, by the comments, I don't know if my point was adequately made. These crimes have a political context. They have a historical context. They're integrated with the prevailing culture and society of the time. And of course, there are no really abrupt ruptures in cultures. They kind of evolves, right? It changes, transforms. So what happened in 47 is very much related, or I would say relevant to what's going on in 2021. That's up for me and for you to make that connection there. So to repeat, I made a note to myself: crimes, whatever and wherever, crimes are never one-offs. They're linked to the politics, society, and the culture of, here's the kicker, of the establishment, right? The establishment is always implicated. If nothing else, it's they who have to investigate, charge the perpetrators, prosecute the crimes, and incarcerate them, right? So they're involved whether they want to be or not. But as we have seen time and time again, the people who are ostensibly in charge, and there's a larger point to this, which I'll get to in a moment, the people supposedly in charge have abrogated, have abandoned, have neglected their responsibility. And we saw that, those multiple examples of that in the recent U.S. presidential election, right? The U.S. Supreme Court, headed by Supreme Court Justice, and yeah, I know all the stories about him being compromised, right? Refused to decide on the behalf of the American people and to defend our constitutional republic. Before I go on, I would also mention the Hillside Strangler case, because not all of it is due to conscious cover-up of high jingo. Police departments are are overtaxed and overworked. Investigators have all kinds of cases. They just can't drop everything and talk about Dr. George Hodel, or whoever it is, O.J. Simpson. They have multiple cases that have to ongoing, and it's incredible how they can juggle all that. It's, keep it straight in their heads, in addition to the emotional toll that it must take on them. So I'm not critical of the people who are doing the hard work. But here's another case, and I think it's cited in passing in the Steve Hodel book. the so-called Black Dahlia, the murder of Elizabeth Short and maybe up to a dozen other women, um, was kind of pushed off the headlines by a succession of crimes. This one was the Hillside Strangler that he alluded to. This started happening around 1979 and 80, and I was alive and living in the LA area when this was going on. And they did apprehend the two principals, Angela Bono and Kenneth Bianchi. I believe they were cousins. This is in Los Angeles again, right? This is a good book, and it's by Ted Schwartz. It was published in, 2004. And I thought it was interesting. He consulted, the author, Schwartz, consulted a Dr. Ralph Allison, who lives in Davis, California, appropriately enough, because Davis, California does have a lot of, and there are organizations, that's why I'm saying this, they have a lot of examples of multiple personality dissociation. And I think I know the reason, but we'll save that for another time. But Dr. Ralph Allison is a specialist in multiple personality and child abuse. This book is, a couple decades old, so I don't know if Dr. Allison still lives there. But I'm going to look him up and see what he has to say about that. Because again, the reason I'm interested in this, not because of the crime as such. Yeah, it's intrinsically interested. I want to understand the larger society and political system so that we can achieve justice and we can preserve the American Republic. You let crimes like this go, and they're linked to the establishment, and what happens is that society implodes, it collapses, it decays. And that's, as I said, that's part of the agenda of multiple groups. They want to see America, the United States of America, crumble. They want to see us erode from within. And they're doing all they can. And many examples of that. They're doing all they can in order to see that happen. Because what does that do? That provides them opportunity for themselves. They can pick up the pieces. They can reconstruct a society that is re-engineered according to their specifications, not those of you and me, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm not going to just repeat some of the details of the Ed Buck case. I have an insight, right? That's part of the research process, something old, something new. And the new that I'm bringing to this marriage, if you will, this wedding of minds and research, is a set of insights that I've been working on. According to my notes, I've been doing it for the last 2 years at least. I have a term for it. It's called the Mandingo syndrome. Mandingo or Mandinka refers to, I think they're still around, a distinctive tribal group in West Africa. I think they're a Yoruba linguistic group, but a lot of them that particular tribe were captured by Arab slavers and other African tribes and sold into slavery. The story, brokered through the Liverpudlian shipping magnates and helping to develop much of the Western world. There are entire books written about how the depopulation, the strategy, was related to the development of industrial capitalism and where we are today. So even in 2021, we're still seeing the resonance crossing this century relationship, right? And part of this Mandingo syndrome is very much in the popular culture. You might be oblivious to it because, well, you need a term. That's why I come up with Mandingo syndrome. You might not know it's a syndrome. You might just take it for granted. Someone came up with it. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of funny, but it's ultimately random in your mind. Again, it's structured. It is connected to the political, economic, historical system. And I refer to the Mandingo syndrome as a psychosexual kink, let's call it. That's not a technical word. It's a psychosexual predilection. How's that? Is that better? And it has to do with interracial sex, right? And up until recently, maybe even currently, there were strong proscriptions punishable by law and imprisonment. They were called anti-miscegenation laws, which are on the books in different states until, I don't know, until the maybe as late as the early 70s. I think at the federal level, they started to disappear. This is one of the outcomes of the civil rights movement. A lot of the federal, or most of all the federal proscriptions or prohibitions against interracial sex, and I'm not going to define it at this point because it goes on and on. Who's white? Who's Asian? You know, if you are the product of a mixed marriage, what group are you? So you know, it goes on and on and on. But race and ethnicity, gender, and is still very much hotly contested. It's still being used and deployed against the American people to break us apart, to have us erode, decay from within. So that's why it's relevant today, this Mandingo syndrome that goes back to the legacy of British, let's call it Anglo-American, and French, and all the different Western powers primarily. We're talking about the African slavery. We're not even talking about Asian slavery. We're not even talking about Central. It's a universe. We're not even talking about Aztec slavery, right? Okay, it's been a universal. We're speaking specifically of the West African connection here. And it figures, I think, centrally into the Ed Buck situation, and by extension, his cohort. And most of you in the chat room have already identified some of the principles. It goes beyond Ted Lieu and Adam Schiff. Those are the more prominent people. I have an article here that talks about a whole list of people that are connected here. Whether they're participating in the Mandingo network, I don't know. That's for us to figure out. But I think Ed Buck was, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So this is psychosexuality of interracial. It's a taboo. Those of you who look at erotica are familiar with it, or you can look at Pornhub if you don't want to spend any money. There's a whole category of interracial sex. When the interracial sex is usually black and white, right? Occasionally there's Asian and white, right? I've studied this, by the way. I'm an expert in American psychosexuality. That's one of my claims to fame. I can go into that at a later time. Right? I've written about it. I've studied it, and it's related again to these power relationships. By the way, our friend Michel Foucault was very much interested in power exchange, sadomasochism, right? Bondage, slavery, mastery, right? That seems to be a basic of cultural life. It's a cultural universal. Who's on top? Who's on bottom? Who's bossing around who? Who's the chief? Who's the serf? On and on and on. And you know, as Marx said, it's really the history of humanity is the clash between different social classes. But I would say even further, it's the clash between who has power and who doesn't. So it's institutionalized. It's in the culture. It's ingrained. And as I will argue, a lot of the people who are benefiting from the high Jingo system in America are practitioners or are involved in the Mandingo syndrome. And Ed Buck is an example of that. I'll explain more what I mean by Mandingo. I'll give you some specific examples. But first, let me give you some examples of the high Jingo, according to Steve Hodell's definition. I'm reading from, let's see here, article that was published in 2018. Even after Moore, this is Gamil Moore and Thomas Dean. Gamil Moore was, I think, 25, 26 years young, and Thomas Dean was older. So, you know, Ed Buck, he's alleged, by the way. He's charged. He hasn't been convicted. So I'll use alleged, even though I'm not an attorney and I'm not I'm not a reporter. I don't have to reserve judgment on whether he's guilty or not. But I'll give him the courtesy of saying these are alleged crimes that he committed. Dean was older, so he wasn't focusing, because these serial killers or multiple killers tend to focus on a certain profile of person. So again, we got to be careful. And I say, well, he only is interested in certain demographics, right? Certain racial group, certain age group. Got to keep open because, as Steve Hodel says, that sort of blindness or sort of parochialism help to impede the case. So we have to keep an open mind. We got two guys on different ends of the age spectrum, 25 and 55. Anyway, the point is, sorry for the digression. Even after they were found dead, Buck continued injecting vulnerable men, and they were all black, African American, with methamphetamine, as part of his sexual gratification, according to the indictment. So he was indicted. He hasn't been convicted yet. Three other men were drugged even after he was indicted. In May 2000, they give the dates and all that. And later on, Ed Buck was brought on to a federal indictment, right? Thank goodness. It took a long time. And again, he was benefiting by the high Jingo system. And eventually, even the political establishment had to say, no, we're going to have to indict on the federal level because this is eroding confidence in us, right? And that's how we're going to win here, by the way. We publicize, we push, we have citizen investigators and individuals who can go beyond what the officially authorized law enforcement people do, or even prosecutors, and come up with our own case and make it and take it to the public directly. And I say this is because we have to get over this idea that people who are quote unquote in charge or authorized or the experts, the authorities, are going to give us justice, right? We, the people, it gets, it's in the Constitution anyway. It's part of our system of self-governance. Well, part of our system of self-governance is self-investigation, self-reportage, right? Not vigilante, but self-prosecution through peaceful means, right? And that's how Ed Buck wound up in jail. And hopefully he's on the way to conviction. It was thanks to, I'll move up a little bit further here. It's thanks to one citizen investigator and community advocate in the best sense of the word. Her name is Jasmine Canick. I might be mispronouncing her name, Cannyck. And I don't know her background, so, gosh, heaven forbid that she turns up in some weird situation. But she is the principal person that kept pushing and pushing and pushing. Hey, listen, there's these deaths here, and there's all this activity that's been reported as part of the official record. Why is this guy, Ed Buck, running around free? We need an indictment here. So, case in point, score one for the good guys. That's you and me. Thank you, Miss Jasmine Canick, or Canick. I'm sorry. Yeah, you can see her on YouTube. I was looking at a reportage. I was reading it because we could use the social media for our purposes, and she was quite prominent using it in sending tweets and keeping it in the public consciousness, awareness. Janice Canick. So anyway, that's an example of what I think is going to help solve our problems, not definitively because they don't go away, not just in this particular case of Ed Buck, but the larger problems of rampant structural criminality that is being visited upon not just the American people but the global population. We're gonna get out of this idea that, oh, please help us. Right. We're going to appeal to you, Mr. Supreme Court Justice, or Mr. President, or Mrs. Congressman. No. Yeah. I mean, you're welcome to join us, but we, the people, are going to solve our own problems. And if you want to stay in office and make yourself useful, yeah, please join us. But otherwise, we're going to put people here in the chat room up for office. We're going to vote for them, and we're going to solve the crooked election system in the same manner that we're doing it here. We're going to talk to engineers who can figure out IP addresses. And, there's really lots of brilliant Americans out there who are awakening in really rapid fashion. So in a way, we had to go through the dark night of the soul and the political system in order to get to this point, but we're getting there. So anyway, as I mentioned, the federal U.S. federal grand jury, so I think it was the Central District of California, intervened finally October 2019. This is a fairly recent case, and I checked already on Bezos.com. There's not a book that's been written about the Ed Buck situation. Maybe they're kind of waiting for the trial and the conviction, if so. And I don't know if he's going to skate or not. We'll find out. But that doesn't mean that you or me can start doing the backstory here. And I think I'm ready. I have tons of notes. That's why I was able to put this talk together fairly quickly. When someone said, "Hey, what about Ed Buck?" in the comment, okay, yeah, what about Ed Buck? I'll do it. I'll go live on Thursday and share with you my investigation up to this point and my notion of the Mandingo syndrome. So anyway, a little bit of backstory of Ed Buck, because the New York Times, which likes to cover for their friends, the Democrats and the Republicans, right? The white shoe establishment Republicans said, "Oh yeah, he was just Ed Buck was just a minor political figure in Los Angeles, right?" They try to play them, but no, he was big time, at least by my estimation. Because for me, $340,000 is a lot of money, and according to this report by KTLA5, and I mentioned the KTLA because they're not syndicated, they're not part of the Fox. So far as I know, I think they're part of a smaller regional network, but they're not Fox. They're definitely not linked to CNN. I'm not saying they're better, but they do have a little bit more independent. They're definitely not network. It's an independent station, KTLA Channel 5, and which I used to, watch regularly when I lived down in that area. It has a huge market. By the way, KTLA was the first one with Cleet Roberts, who did what they called SIG alerts, where they would get up in the helicopter and show all the traffic jams now. And we're quite used to drones spying on everybody, right? But that was a legitimate use of helicopters for reportage. That was KTLA's and Cleet Roberts. That was their innovation back then. Okay, so Ed Buck ran for city council in West Hollywood, 2007. He lost. And according to this KTLA report, he donated, like I said, $340,000 to Democratic campaigns and causes over many years. Before that, from what I understand, he was a Republican. And I tell you this because let's not be diverted or distracted. Oh, he's a Democrat. He's a Republican. Bad, good. They play that game. Doesn't matter. Let's talk about, Ed Buck. And that's not his real name, by the way. I was, trying to find it. That even that's phony about him, Ed Buck. Ed Buck sounds like the name of a porn star, doesn't it? Gosh, Mike. And I think there's probably a connection there. I haven't really untangled it yet. But West Hollywood is, for those of you who don't know, it's a community that, if not majority, but it's controlled by the LGBTQ mafia. And yeah, they have characteristics of organized crime, just like any other group, whether it's LGBTQ, it could be Latino, it could be African American, could be Asian American, could be Chinese, it could be Taiwanese American, right? I'm not, it's an equal opportunity employer. Criminality, everybody wants to get in on it. It's a cultural universal. So I'm not disparaging LGBTQ as such, but they run the city. They run it. I was living there for a short time, and West Hollywood used to be kind of dumpy, because the studios closed down after they were sued by the federal government for monopoly, and that was kind of bring them into the system so that they'll do propaganda directly for Pentagon and NATO, because there were too many independent people. So yeah, we're gonna mess you up and destroy the studios, and and these guys were top level, right? We're talking about the original movie moguls. So enjoy your fame wherever you are. If you're riding high right now, you could be Oprah Winfrey, but it's going to be gone before it's all over. It's all going to be snatched back, clawed back. So anyway, he's a player, Ed Buck. He was also, not surprisingly, an AIDS activist. Was he interested in AIDS victims? Probably not. It was a thing, just like Black Lives Matters was a thing for a while. It's a money harvesting. And I'm not minimizing the problems that they capitalize and exploit on them. And that's not what I'm about. But they're usually a pretext from some larger scheme. I mean, those of you in the chat room, you know that yourself. So he was a quote unquote AIDS activist, and he gained fame by leading a 1987 campaign to recall the Republican Arizona Governor Evan Mecham. I think it's pronounced Mecham. And Mecham was crooked. Arizona, my gosh, And by the way, now Arizona is a blue state. Through all the different machinations and intrigue here. And again, Mecham is not any better. He might be even worse. And he is a Republican. So he switched, Buck switched. He went AC to DC or DC to AC. And he claims that the GOP was intolerant of the gay community. Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's obviously, that doesn't hold any water, right? Is at least in certain quarters of the GOP, but that's the perception. Like Republicans are, sexually backward and repressive and homophobic is the term. Those of you who are in the chat room know better than that. GLBT politics and predilections cross party lines. It's just a fake dialect that they've set up for themselves. Here's this one. This part of his biography bears some research, and it's a common feature of these characters. They have a mystery years, sort of like the wilderness years. You can't really. I'm not casting aspersions on Jesus of Nazareth, but they have a missing time in their life, right? You got Ed Buck, who was a model in Europe in his youth. Accordingly, I think he was probably being read into the program or groomed or handled. You have, by the way, he's now a cabinet member in the Biden administration. You have a Javier Becerra, who comes out of California, who had some wilderness years in Salamanca, España. Right, Salamanca, by the way, it's a medieval town, and it's very much connected to the Ismaili network and the network that I was talking about earlier, the Sabbatean, the Frankist, as well as the Société de Jesus, right? It's got all, so, someone's got to probe Becerra, Javier, what were you doing over there, right? Yeah, he worked for a friend's company, and okay, he's supposedly a successful businessman. He's wealthy, and this is the legend where Ed Buck got all his money to distribute to his cronies and his friends and his helpers. You and I in the chat room know better. He's probably a pass-through, right? It's like a Jeffrey Epstein type deal where supposedly you're this business genius, but really you're the guy that's distributing the money. And how did we find that? We found this out through citizen journalism, how it really works and who these people really are. If you're just reading the Los Angeles Times or CNN or Fox News even, you're just thinking in simple terms, oh, he's rich, he's paying them off for political favors. No, it goes much deeper than that. So he retired to West Hollywood in 1991 at age 37. That's pretty young for retirement, even for very wealthy people. And guess what? Ed Buck was active in animal rescue efforts. So he's doing all kinds of warm, fuzzy activity that makes us want to love him and accept him and vote him into office. He never made it, but he's got something much better than political office. He's got power, right? He cares not who holds office. He can buy whatever he needs through the distribution of other people's money. It's called OPM, other people's money. So the U.S., as I mentioned, the U.S. Attorney General's office, they had to intervene. Again, I'm saying this because we have to give some credit to them. They seem to have abdicated their responsibility as we experienced in the recent election theft. But in this case, they had to come forth and convene a grand jury and charge Ed Buck with 4 additional felonies in addition to his other crimes. And again, we'll have to thank Jasmine Koenig. Okay, let me talk a little bit about the Mandingo syndrome here as it pertains to Ed Buck. And know that Gamal, if I haven't mentioned already, Gamal Moore was an African-American man, age 25. I think maybe I was 26. And Timothy Dean was an African-American man. And the different men who were writing home or emailing their loved ones, hey, I'm in LA and I met this weird guy who wants to inject me with methamphetamine, and I woke up in the nick of time, and he was offering. I mean, there's all this correspondence going on, and this information was brought to the authorities. They refused to act on it for the longest time. Those gentlemen themselves were also African American. So I can only conclude that Ed Buck had a predilection for black men, black males, and they were all gay. They were all gay. They were part of this, which was news to me, part of some system that it's called Pay Party and Play. Right? There's an app or a website or something like that Ed Buck used, and someone who has internet expertise can do an article, a piece on that. I mean, I would be interested to find out how does that work? Is it like those dating apps? I don't know. Is it like I can't remember. What is it? Ashley Madison or something? That's kind of like the mainstream. Or there's a sugardaddy.com. I mean, there's all these types of enterprises that have sprung up in the wake of the internet, the online revolution. So, future research there. That's how he was able to find these men who were part of this network of party and play, and they were into drugs, they were into methamphetamine, they were into this recently identified as a health problem drug. The initials are GMB, I believe, and I have some literature. I have some medical literature on that details. I'm not going to bore you with that, but I did do my sort of medical scientific research on that. Let me talk about the Mandingo syndrome more specifically. There's a large volume of academic research on this theme. They don't call it the Mandingo syndrome. So far as I know, it's Professor Hamamoto who talks about it. But it has to do with this white, however you define it, Irish American, Scots, whatever, however you define white, and black sexual attraction, right? And this again goes back to the legacy of slavery. And according to Lisa Cardin, she's one person who has done one of probably hundreds, if not thousands, of articles on this theme, interracial theme. And I mention her in specific because I see here that she's a PhD candidate, anticipated 2000. So she's probably a professor somewhere, or maybe she's working with the State Department, creating memes, or new approaches to control the American public. But she was a PhD candidate when she wrote this, Yale University, MA, Doctor of Master of Philosophy, and a Juris Doctorate at Yale. And further Ivy, she's got a master's degree from Harvard, right? So anyway, she comes from an elite background, and these are the people who get their material out there to create an intellectual zeitgeist, so to speak, so that we only hear one side of the story. But today, Professor Hamamoto shifts the story off to the side and puts his story up front and central to it. Here's the title of it. I'm not going to belabor this particular point, this essay of Lisa Cardin. It's titled Sexualized Racism / Gendered Violence, subtitled Outraging the Body Politic in the Reconstruction South. So what is she already doing? She's already talking about a certain narrowly defined, important though it is, part of American history, the Reconstruction after Civil War, talking about middle to late 19th century, early part of 20th century, right? In the South, as if it's only in these former slave states, right? The states of the Confederacy, right? And as far as I know, Ed Buck is from the North, and he's from the urban area where there's full integration, yet he still has this predilection for gay Black men. So it tells me that the Mandingo syndrome is not bound by history or by geography. It goes deeper. And I think it goes back to, and I'm not going to really delve into it. I did it the last talk. I think it goes back to the Sabbatean connection, but that's another discussion. Let me just say also that the Mandingo syndrome, whereas it identifies a certain Yoruba-speaking tribal group of Africa south of the Sahara, the Mandingo syndrome applies to all groups where it talks about, men, primarily white men who have power, not women that I know of. Maybe there are. That's another area of study if we can identify. I think Madonna was into kind of Mandingo consciousness for a while. That was part of her sexual liberation attempt, the engineering of it, right? But for the most part, it's a male preserve, right? It doesn't just pertain to African American males. It also, I'll use my own group, okay, just to show you I'm not prejudiced. And I'll name some people here because they brought it on themselves. They identify it. But there is a subset of Asian American men, gay men, whether they were gay to start or groomed to be so, I don't know. But they were very much part of the Hollywood scene from the 1930s to the 40s and 50s, especially after the World War II. You have Japanese were kind of rehabilitated, so they had to bring in some Asian actors. People like James Shigeta and people like George Takei, George Takei, Zulu from Star Trek. And through the 60s, civil rights, but one aspect of their sexuality that they shared, they were gay. James Shigeta, who co-starred with Elvis, Elvis Presley, Aaron Presley, yeah, that Elvis. He co-starred with him in a movie called Paradise Hawaiian or Paradise Hawaii, right? And any number of shows. Later on, he played villains and stuff. But he was like this good-looking leading man, right? And he was in a couple of films that dealt with interracial themes, right? Played a detective, an LA detective. I can't remember the names offhand. I have the films. So that's James Shigeta. But once it became okay to out yourself or to come out, right? James Shigeta, and he never wrote a book about it. He never tried to capitalize. He said, "Yeah, I'm gay, and I'm part of this, this network." So this is part of the Hollywood scene. Now, more militantly gay, as most of you know, is George Takei. He says, "When you think gay, say George Takei." And there's a documentary on that. He became the official or unofficial spokesman for Asia Pacific, LGBTQ, right? And he was even the president of the Japanese American National Museum, which, by the way, is an intelligence outfit. It's been infiltrated. I think it was started as a part of a Air Force RAND Boeing type of operation, administered by high-level Japanese American sons and daughters of Japanese American OSS intelligence types. But that's a different story. The point I'm establishing here is that whether you're Latino, black, brown, white, or red, that this Mandingo dynamic, you're the houseboy, you're the coolie, you're the bottom, as it's called, and then you are here. You're like Dan Blocker. You're Hop Sing here, and then you got the whole Ponderosa, all over you. And so that's the situation with George Takei and these others. So that's what I'm talking. I'm talking about this unequal power relationship. And so far as African Americans are concerned, where in America they might have held that subordinate position. Once they are overseas in Asian countries, then there's a whole Mandingo connection there between Black men and Japanese women, Black men and Korean women, Black men and Vietnamese women. So I haven't come up with a term for that, but it's not Mandingo because the people who are on the subordinate end are not African American. They're actually on the top. And by the way, that's the only song that I didn't like in the Bob Marley canon. It's called Buffalo Soldier, right? And that's he's celebrating people who were African origins who were used to kill Indians and then Mexicans and then Asians. I don't think that's we should celebrate anything about anybody killing anybody. We need love and we need peace. So I'm just saying that in the academic world, you're only going to hear part of the story, and it's a distorted. I don't care about it being part of the story. It's a distorted one. It's being purposely distorted to hide the true contours of political power here. So let me go into some of my notes here on, let's see, Adam Schiff. There was an article, and again, this is somewhat of a distraction. It's published by Politico. So Schiff has his eyes on being California's AG, Attorney General, and Pelosi's on board with it. Okay, they stole power, and they're in charge now. Pelosi, who's also from California, and Schiff. So the job has been done. They got their boy in there. It's Joe Biden. So he's going to come back to California as Attorney General. So this is a big issue, not just for me, but for everybody. Adam Schiff's, and he's buddies with Ed Buck. Most of you already know this. That's why I'm just kind of going straight to the chase here. And Ted Lieu. He's going to come back Attorney General, and he's going to go in on everybody who remotely is critical of the lockdown of the administration, and anybody who is within government, private citizens, within the military, the police departments, elective office, you name it. As Attorney General, he's going to be taking on cases or developing cases, parallel constructed cases, going on to every person who is not on board with the NATO world order, of which he is one of the stooges, right? So he's coming back home to clean up California and purge it of any last bastions of resistance to the Great Reset that one of his friends over in the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, is promoting. We've already talked about Xavier Becerra and his missing years in Salamanca, España. All right, so it's out there in the semi-indie news, right? Let's see. Yeah, here's another article. And again, semi-indie. I say semi-indie because I think they're still controlled by the corporate. It says why Nancy Pelosi is ignoring Adam Schiff and Ted Lieu's Ed Buck problem. That's the headline, right? And this comes out of what? It's a tweet. It's a tweet, and again, I think it's a sort of a limited hangout type situation because it looks like Adam Schiff is coming back for good. Okay, let me move into the Mandingo situation, and I just should state that this is to give credit where credit is due. This is not. The Mandingo syndrome is my concoction, but I only came up with that after first doing all the hard work by unearthing a lot of articles on this, right? Give you an example. There's a book called Mandingo. There was a film, by the way, that came out. I think it was in 1975. That was about this southern slave plantation deal where the African slave was hitting it with the master's wife, who's white. And then the master, who was white, was hitting it with the black female slave, right? That was a sensational book back in 1957. This was like when the civil rights movement was just kind of getting underway, right? 1957. And here comes this book, Mandingo. It's back in press, by the way. It's hard to read. It's really long. It's kind of like Gone with the Wind, but with heavy, interracial sex running all the way through it. And of course, they made a movie, Hollywood people. I'd like to find out how that was financed and who financed it. This is just hinky, as Steve Hodel would call it, right? Hinky. It's a suspicion. I think whoever funded Mandingo, the movie, it was probably the intelligence agencies, again, to create racial tension and conflict, just as the civil rights movement was beginning to get some headway, right? They're experts at that. But anyway, that's a future research topic. All kinds of academic. I'm not going to bore you with it. Exploring History with Mandingo in the Journal American Studies, 2013, fairly recently. Master Slave, Sex Acts, Mandingo and the Race Sex Paradox, and the Film Journal, Wide Angle, 1999. Ja Gilmer, Suing for Freedom, Interracial Sex, Slave Law and Racial Identity, Post-Revolutionary, and North Carolina Law Reviews. There's a lot of law articles and reviews, journals that talk about this relationship. So it's there. It's huge. It's part of our culture to the point where academics spend their entire career, at least good part of their career, talking about this dynamic. Okay, let's move because we're running out of time. 10 minutes. We're 10-minute drill. We're going to move over to Adam Schiff, who is probably going to be the next Attorney General of the state of California, so that he can, like solar wind, just blow away all of the crimes and hide them and obscure them, so that he and his colleague can avoid ever being indicted and benefit from the high Jingo system. So here's a article, a headline by True Pundit, and these headline reads: Clinton whistleblower, Feds probe Adam Schiff dressed like an Egyptian at bizarre sacrifice parties at Ed Buck's meth mansion. This is in 2019. I'm saving all the salacious part, ladies and gentlemen, towards the very end, because I didn't want my stream interrupted at the outset. So thank you for your patience. Now I'm going to get to what's really going on here, and now hopefully you'll be able to see, because you watched last Tuesday's talk on the Elizabeth Short murders, right, by Steve Hodel, and I gave my insight about how this is reflective of the Sabbatean Frankist underground in Los Angeles, in the U.S., and probably a good part of the world. So here's the article. Here's what it talks about. Embattled Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff was dressed in ancient Egyptian-themed garb at two wild costume parties at Ed Buck's meth and sex mansion, according to Clinton whistleblower and insider. I'm quoting still. And the FBI is probing Schiff, who is now the target of federal investigation focused on Congressman's more than frequent trips to Ed Buck's meth mansion. Who's the head of the FBI now? I know Robert Mueller's long gone. I mean, all the, Barr's gone. They did all their cleanup while President Trump was still in office. Don't expect any indictments coming soon due to FBI probes, as they're called. The only probe they're doing is what's going on at these little mansion parties with these exotic Egyptian or Aztec themes, right? These where they have embalments and mummification and all different types of sex ritual, a la Aleister Crowley. Perhaps this is just my editorial opinion here. Buck is a high-profile millionaire Democratic benefactor who has contributed and bundled large amounts of cash to Democrats, including Schiff, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Kamala Harris. Hey, isn't she vice president? Yeah, asterisk, right? And the list goes on and on. Buck was arrested last month after a nearly dead man escaped from Buck's home after Buck allegedly plied him with meth. Now, here's where you take it with a grain of salt. The confidential or the informant here is Larry Nichols, and you might know Larry Nichols from the Clinton Chronicles. I found that VHS, and by the way, Petra Matsushiocho, I think it's pronounced. I can't remember his name. I think he recently died, but he's the guy that funded and directed the Clinton Chronicles. I have a copy of the VHS. I studied carefully, and it's a very well research document, and I tend to believe what Larry Nichols has said. He was a frequent guest on the Alex Jones show, and he had some health problems. I mean, that's why we haven't seen him lately or maybe he has passed on. I don't know. I also have his book. I think he published a book, Larry Nichols. I try to be as complete as possible, ladies and gentlemen, just so I can kind of vet these people and scope them out. But anyway, it says, going on with Larry Nichols. Bill Clinton, his biography described Nichols as a dangerous man. Yeah, I understand. Clinton would know because Nichols spearheaded many of Clinton's political black bag ops in Arkansas and Washington, D.C. for the Clinton cartel and beyond before he turned whistleblower. He was an insider before he realized that his own life was in danger. And I think we owe Larry Nichols gratitude for helping to get people look at who Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton really are. I think we have a fairly good understanding of what they really represent. And of course, thanks to our associate, our colleague, our friend, the investigative reporter Georgia Webb, it's even deeper, right? It's even deeper than that. But we had to lead up to it. We had to depend on the reportage of people like Larry Nichols to get to this point. Okay, let me just finish up with this article here. Again, independent journalism. Quoting, 2 men previously died at Buck's mansion from drug overdoses, but Buck was never charged by the Los Angeles police. Wow, shades of the George Hodel situation, or the Dr. Hodel situation. Finally, Buck was charged in September with running a drug house and doping up victims, and then allegedly acting out his twisted sexual fantasies on the incapacitated victims, according to prosecutors. All right, we've already talked about that. I have maybe I'll post it in the comments below on my Patreon, so you can link to it and read the whole article here. Now, there's a connection with the Black Lives Matter. Remember, all these crimes are not one-offs, and they typically have these different they're tendrils connected. You can follow the IP addresses, or you can do it the old-fashioned way and look at different names, and they ring a bell, right? But there was a helicopter accident back in January of 2020, and it might hide a Mandingo setup arranged by one of the victims. She was killed. Her name's Amy Gannon. She died in one of those helicopter accidents, right? By the way, when are we ever going to find out what happened to Kobe Bryant, right, with his helicopter accident? Anyway, she died in a helicopter accident, and she was close to her former Wisconsin governor, Scott Walker. And you had these characters. Let's see here. I don't think it was Black Lives Matter. I'm sorry, but there was a sort of a scandal that was following Governor Scott Walker that had these Mandingo syndrome overtones, very similar to Ed Buck, right? That's why I call it the syndrome. That's why I don't say it's a one-off. It's a syndrome. And I think if you look at corporate, not just elected officials, but corporate types, police officials, government, you're going to probably see something very similar. And it might necessarily be an African-American young man, as in the case with Scott Walker, but it could be an Asian-American young man. It could be probably more Latinos will start showing up as part of, let's call it, some other syndrome, for Latinos, not Mandingo. Let's call it, the mestizaje syndrome, right? So, okay, what else do I have here? I'll give you another citation book, which I have. It's by a guy named Scott. I think it's David Scott, 2010. It says, Extravagant Abjection, Blackness, Power, and Sexuality in the African-American Literary Imagination. It's in literature written by African-Americans. Good example that I know offhand was one of James Baldwin, who wrote the short book, Go Tell It on the Mountain. He was an icon in the civil rights time. He was an expatriate. He was, by the way, he was also part of that network of American expats, literary artist types who were in Paris after World War II, right? You know about Hemingway and Fitzgerald and James Joyce there in the interwar period, right, 1930s. But after the war, after World War II, there were a large number of people, and James Baldwin was part of that. But he didn't present himself as such, but he was part of the Mandingo network. He was a gay African American man who had been kind of brought in, sort of like, Ed Buck was bringing in his cohort and was getting his books published in Paris. And then when the civil rights movement started coming off, he was brought back to the U.S. to become the voice of African America. And his very first novel, Giovanni's Room, was about his sort of Mandingo relationship with some guy he met over there, right? I don't mean to use this in a disparaging fashion. I'm just trying to use this kind of as a shorthand. So anyway, there's examples of this in African American literature itself. I think even Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison. I think even the autobiography of Malcolm X, which was, by the way, transcribed and edited by Alex Haley, Roots, Alex Haley. That's him. The autobiography of Malcolm X. And in fact, in a critical, fairly recent, 5 years, 6 years, recent a biography by Manning Marable, of all people, who's a socialist. He's a DSA, Democratic Socialist of America. And I think he wound up at Harvard, the African American studies, but an incredible scholar. Yeah, Manning. I met him once at a conference. Brilliant guy, but he did a biography of Malcolm X, and apparently Malcolm X was part of a Mandingo setup himself, right? Malcolm X, and again, it created a huge furor and excitement in how can Malcolm X, Stoops? He wasn't Malcolm X back then. His name was Malcolm Little. His street name was Red, Red, because he had red hair. He was a hustler. That's where Malcolm X comes from. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that Malcolm X had that early type of experience. So the point is, and I run out of time, ladies and gentlemen, I'm showing you here is that in the example of Dr. George Hodel, we have a whole network and a whole substrate related to very, very deep types of psychosexual predilections, let's say. And this in the same case, the same observation holds for Ed Buck. The Ed Buck story is going to go deep, and it's going to reveal a lot more than murder, as heinous as they were, these crimes. It's going to be a lot more than this, the killing of these two African American men. And it's going to have to be so because Professor Hamamoto laid it out today and raised the bar of the type of critical analysis that's going to be required in looking at these cases. And by the way, I'm thinking of developing a course so I can provide a framework, a checklist to do not just true crime, but to do investigative research, because I want you, the people in general, right, of any background, with you don't need an advanced degree, you don't need any degree. You have to have a curiosity, and you have to have a story yourself that you want to find out about. But you need a structure in order to frame it in a certain way so that you can help us. You can share your insights, your findings with us, so that we can better do our own type of reportage, so we don't have to depend on assets like Donnybrook, O'Sullivan, or Anderson CIA Cooper, or whoever else is out there. We'll do it ourselves. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's I didn't get through all of it, but I got through the bulk of it, and I'll continue this theme later on. I think I'm going to be doing some more true crime, and just as a preview, I want to touch upon. Again, I'll use the term that the press uses, and I hesitate to do it because I don't want to denigrate the families and, of course, the victims of these crimes themselves. But there's a whole series of crimes that have been called the smiley face killer, right, is out there. So I'll use that because that's I'm going to be going in on that. I'm researching currently. There's some books, some literature out there, and it's kind of stumped me. And what's interesting about it is the victims, talk about worthy versus, quote unquote, worthy versus unworthy victims, quote unquote. All the victims are middle class, young, college students or post-college white men, right, who are turning up drowned, right? There's lots of them. So that's going to be in and maybe with your assistance, we can figure that one out. That's a deep one, and that's going on right now. That's an unsolved crime. This is in process. So join me next week for some more adventure and in investigation, and join the great John O'Loughlin, the great George Webb, myself, who is invited as a weekly guest to Macduff. Excuse me, pardon me. Macduff Lives. All right, Macduff Lives channel, 5 o'clock Pacific Standard, 8 o'clock Eastern Time. Macduff Lives. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you then. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your support. And we'll see you soon. Bye.